All right, welcome everybody. We're going to get started. This is going to be a little bit longer of a presentation. I wish I could have been here last week for the first one. I did watch it from California, which is the beauty of technology, to be able to still join my home church, even though I'm not in the state of Florida. But just a few words of how this came about. When I started talking about Creationism seminar, I talked to some workers, some teachers, professors at Advent Health University, and I was directed to Dr. Dobias and Dr. Butler. So they are going to present, you heard the first one last week. They sent me a whole syllabus. This is a part of a course that they teach at Advent Health University to all the students coming that deal with the issues of creationism. And as they brought up, most churches don't really wrestle with these. And we're not going to do this in a sermon series, but during our Wednesday night studies, I wanted to wrestle with the issues that are surrounding this topic. And I'm just so glad they've agreed to come for these 4 nights here in March and let us sit in on what we would get to. This is a lot cheaper for us than if we tried to enroll in their class at Advent Health University. And they're taking, well, more than just the 4 nights. They're preparing and coming, and we've got worksheets, and we have lots of materials tonight. And tonight we're going to be treated to a lecture by Dr. Russ Butler. When we talked about this, he's a biology professor at Advent Health University. And when we talked about this topic, he said, well, I could present it if I'm able to do 2 topics at once, because otherwise people get the wrong idea, and I think you'll see why as we get halfway through his lecture. So I'm not going to say any more. I'll let him introduce the topic, but anyway, we're just glad that they're willing to come and be with us tonight. Let's just bow our heads for prayer, and then we'll get started. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this time to think and to ponder the great issues around the creation of the world. Lord, you've told us to come, let us reason together, and that's what we want to do tonight. We ask that your Holy Spirit will be here, that you'll bless Dr. Butler as he presents these topics to us. We thank you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Pastor Doug. Appreciate that a lot. I was looking at their video about some of the work you guys were doing here, history of evolution, history of geology, and stuff like that, and I was very, very impressed that you were being forthright and speaking about it and not disparaging. My goal tonight is to not convince you of anything. It doesn't mean I might not try to be convincing, but not to convince you of anything, and I'm not in the mood to disparage any worldview or any views out there. I don't believe in that. So I am going to talk a little bit about creation evolution. Now, I'm Russ Butler. Go by Russ. That's fine. I came out of the womb from my mom loving snakes. Don't know why, just love snakes. Then it was all of that. And then it was birds. And so I am a 3rd-generation Seventh-day Adventist. So my kids are 4th-generation Seventh-day Adventist. I've been in the Seventh-day Adventist church my whole life. I feel that because of that, and I'm not trying to pick on other religions, I think it afforded us an opportunity, a technique, a style to think about our religion. One of the reasons is we were always defending a little bit about Seventh day when there was all these other people going to church on Sunday. So we were supposed to ask questions. And I believe in that. I don't believe questions dissolve faith. They buttress faith. So that's what we're going to do tonight. Now, for my training, I went to Seventh-day Adventist schools all the way through my freshman year in college. From there, I earned my undergraduate degree in geography from the University of New Orleans, and then I went to Vanderbilt University, and I have a PhD in biology. I studied birds, so I like birds. The reason I like birds is that got me out of going to summer camp. I'll tell you that story later sometime. Now, I don't study birds now. I am a population health researcher. It's connected, and it's about technology. So what I'd like to do now is I would like you to look at the screen, and I want to take a minute. I want you to either write it down or think about it. 3 bullet points of your description of evolution, and I want you to think about 3 bullet points of your description of creation. I got my stopwatch out. Love to use my stopwatch. Why this exercise? In my experience, and I get a lot of this, when we have the creation-evolution debate, and I like what you said, I don't like the tone on either side sometimes. I've seen the combatants in the argument, and I'm overstating that, yelling at one another, and I realize, and this is a lot of time, they have not even fully understood nor defined what their thoughts were. It was kind of, they haven't rigorously done that. No offense, but you could often find, if you interjected in the argument, you could find a common piece of interest, common ground, and then they would be able to discuss it. So today, creation evolution, what is a believer to do? This is often how it's portrayed. In our class, we do talk a lot about understanding reason and logic. I do believe this is a false dichotomy, either one or the other. And the one group on one side says if you believe the other one, that's terrible, you're going to be unsaved. And the other group says that. If you believe in that side and not us, you're going to be unsaved. You see this kind of rhetoric and attitude in politics. You got to follow one or the other, and if you don't follow this one, that one's is an apostate and a heretic and Satan's minion. And they say the other thing. What does that do with us? Because when I talk to individuals out there that first have diametrically opposite views, you find that you can find common ground. So why is there this false dichotomy? And I do think that is the case. Now, I know about being an Adventist, and I don't mean to undermine any of the words or the concepts, but I think that it would help us to consider that there could be different ideas out there. So last week, as you guys can see on the top slide, Dr. Tobias, Stan, my colleague, and it's a pleasure to teach with him, we talked about flood stories, can they be ignored? Catastrophism, mass extinction events. Looks like they're going on. Yellowstone Petrified Forest, Mount St. Helens and Spirit Lake, Fossil Butte in Wyoming. We're talking about fossilization there. This is a really fascinating thing. The fish eating another fish. They now have sufficient detail in fossils that they can replicate the pigment molecules in the skin or in the feathers. What? So they can estimate the color of dinosaurs. They are not like the ones I saw in the 60s, the Sinclair dinosaur, dumb and stupid. Seems like they were dynamic, even warm-blooded creatures. There's like nearly 300 ancient global historical flood legends. Interesting. Those peoples that lived along coasts, their flood stories are often about waves. Those people living inland, their flood stories are often about floods. You guys have an estimate of what you might find a wave called if you're living on a coast and there was an earthquake offshore. There is clear evidence of multiple catastrophic events, and I think this is really gaining strength. Let me tell you about this. We talked about uniformitarianism, and you have as well. That's passé, but that is only passé over the last 15 or 20 years. I took geology. It was uniformitarianism. In the face of obvious catastrophism, okay, it is no longer. And I'm going to provide some understanding about Darwinian evolution, that story. And I want you guys to be cautious, and all of us, about that. And I'm going to tell you about that. So this is happening. I have to change our teaching over the years because we have new information. Some catastrophic event killed the dinosaurs and a host of other creatures. A lot of other stuff died too, okay? Could this be related to the KT event or the Chicxulub crater? Why not? There are marine fossils all over the world, including Mount Everest. How did they get there? Floods, orographic, mountain building processes? What's going on? But they're there. Now, the thing about it is, while fossils are indications of a long Earth, the fossilization event itself is an indication of rapid covering and deposition. There's like two sides being supported with that. Catastrophism demonstrates that rapid change can happen in a short period of time. That's absolutely correct, okay? This is a direct challenge to uniformitarianism. However, I did want to put out there that radioactive decay is profoundly uniform. This is what we call radiometric dating. Carbon-14 dating is not the only one. There's about 30 different radioactive decay measurements out there. Carbon-14 is just a shorter, used for a shorter amount of time, but there's a lot of them. That decay rate is remarkably consistent. Therefore, you will get the pushback that says, aha, you can't change the decay rate of radioactive elements, therefore if there's a half-life of 1 billion years, and I know that how much uranium was deposited in the volcanic soil, and I know how it is here, we know that the Earth is 2 to 3 billion years old. QED, that's it, you're done with it. There are some arguments, this is not about geology, but that particular thing can happen, we just need to know how much was in the original specimen in the first place. I will refer to some literature on that, and maybe sometime we'll talk about that. Could these mass extinction events be related to the biblical flood? Dr. Tobias made a strong parallel there. The fossil evidence gives strong support for this. Diversity. Now, we had to do a little bit of formatting, so I love this kind of thing. Why did I have diversity and complexity up there? It's fun that the complexity got the L and the T and the Y mixed up. I am going to ask you to use these as your conceptual foci for this talk. Diversity. What does that mean? Lots of different stuff. Complexity, not simple. My experience, and I've been doing this a lot of years, is that there's a lot of living things, and they are way different from each other. You have from bacteria and prokaryotes, you got the seaweed drifting in, the sargassum drifting in, you got diatoms, you have elephants, you have trees, you have seaweeds, you have algae, you have plankton, you have birds, you have probably 20 million species of insects. You have a lot of different things, and there are a tremendous amount of body plans. Some bodies are goopy, like oysters, goopy inside. Other ones are elegant, giraffes. They live fine. There's a remarkable variety of creatures out there. They live from the Mariana Trench, Dr. Tobias showed that, it's about 35,000 feet deep, to about 26,000 feet up on Everest. It's a little jumping spider that seems to be up there. So there's about a 10-mile vertical difference in animals living, where living creatures are. That's an incredible variety. And it looks like some creatures actually live in the sky. Okay, I'm going to go through these slides. I just want you to gloss over, and I want you to experience some diversity. I do like that California mountain king snake up there. Now, you see there's a creature in the lower right panel right here. Okay? That creature has, it's got some spines on it. Does anybody know what that is, quickly? It's from Australia and New Guinea. It is an echidna. I have that up there for a reason. What do echidnas, how do they have young? They lay eggs. Leathery like eggs, remarkably similar to reptiles. You creationist, echidnas are mammals. They evolved after reptiles, from reptiles. They still hold over leathery egg cases. QED, common ancestry. Maybe not, but they do lay eggs. Okay? Kangaroos. There's about 1 million insect species, 400,000 species of insects or beetles. It's about 500,000 species now. About 1 in every 4 species on the planet is a beetle. Okay? Why? We don't know. But that's pretty incredible. We actually think there's probably 20 million species of insects. There's about 375,000, about 400,000 different species of plants. You know, there's about 16 to 20,000 different orchids alone. There's about almost 10,000 reptiles. Reptiles are lizards, alligators, turtles, snakes, some weird things called amphibians and other creatures. Well, caecilians, amphibians are the amphibians. Very interesting critters. I love them. Okay? There's like 5,500 species of mammals. Did you know that there's 2,500 rodents and 1,240 bats? So there's like 3,700 species of mammals are either bats or rodents. There's 40,000 different crustaceans. 10,000 different birds. I met a guy who's seen 8,000 species. Whoa, I'm a birder, but I don't have 8,000 species. And that's a resplendent quetzal on the right there. I've always wanted to see that bird, Central America. Diversity and complexity. These things are alive, and we're going to look at some diversity, and we're going to look at some complexity. Whatever worldview you have, I'm going to suggest what I just showed you is independent of your worldview. It is facts, it exists, it's there. This stuff exists. We are going to put it into our worldview, but regardless of your worldview, if you didn't have any thoughts at all, this stuff would still be here. And I think that's a great question. Why? I have a personal view. I think the Creator is a very, loves diversity, should I say. That's my thoughts. I don't know, but I think He does. Now, I also want you to understand that there's a scale in life. So we're going to start off with a common situation. You start off with your atoms, and then from your atoms you go to the organelles inside your cells. Then we go to cells. You can stop right there and say some cells are the living organism, paramecium, okay, or malaria. They are a single-cell living entity. So are bacteria, but they're a different type of cell. They don't have nuclei. And then from cells you go to tissues, from tissues to organs to organ systems, from organ systems to organisms. And we are an organism. From organisms, you go to populations, you go to communities, ecosystems, and then you go to the biosphere. All these things are not independent, they're related. Okay? So when we talk about this, we also want to look through the life on the planet. And we didn't have any marine stuff in there, but you get what I'm talking about. Okay? So complexity. There's enough DNA, if you guys look at the top here, there's enough DNA in your body. If I was to stretch it out, tie it together and stretch it out, it would go from the Earth to the Sun and back, 186 million miles of DNA. There's about 6 feet of DNA wrapped up in your nucleus. Sometimes in your nucleus, there's 12 feet of DNA. That's just before it divides. 6 feet of DNA in every one of your cells. We think there's about 50 to 100 trillion cells in a human body. No one has stopped to count them, but we estimate it by energetics. DNA folds in relation to a thing called topology. A mathematical branch, completely independent, was like, wait a minute, it's about folding. DNA folds. I got 6 feet of DNA in a microscopic cell, and the nucleus is way smaller than that, and it folds. And it can't fold at random because it's got information in it, and if it's folded bad, you can't get that out. I need the information in DNA for the body to function. So it's got to fold in a specific way. It's remarkable. 50 trillion cells. There's about 1 million reactions for the average cell per second. The surface area of your intestines will cover a tennis court. Blood vessels on your body could surround the world. There's about 100 million neurons. Looks like there's about 100 billion, 100 trillion connections in your brain. We're not quite sure. So, however, our computational power will be superseded by computers in about 5 to 10 years. Another 5 years will supersede all of our computational power of every human combined. One generic cell, all the other cells from it. Have you guys ever heard of a pluripotent stem cell? How does that happen? How can you get information to go from something that could go to any other cell? You have a new organ about every 4 years. Except for neurons, they don't divide, but you have a new organ about every 4 years. Okay? There, we have this course, Issues in Science and Religion, and does teaching about evolution and evidence schools destroy faith in God. Stan and I were talking about this. We're like, maybe we should assess this. It's pre- and post-testing. We asked them some questions. And at the end of it, we did the analysis and their anecdotes, and we'll fill this in later. It's like, wait a minute. They didn't mind doing this. They actually enjoyed listening to other topics. They wanted to hear it. They had not heard this stuff before because people seemed to be afraid. Now, we're at Advent Health University. We have atheists that come into the class. We have agnostics that come into the class. And what I think we have established is that when the students leave, they've thought about things they had not thought about, and they're more willing to listen to others. Viewpoints. Oop. All right, Darwin. Ooh, he's either a good guy or a bad guy. He's buried at Westminster Abbey. I took a picture of him. You're not supposed to take a picture of his grave, but I did. I didn't bring it here because I couldn't find it in my phone. But he's buried right next to Isaac Newton's grave. Now, that's a real grave. His is just in the floor. But I got to see Charles Darwin's grave, and that was kind of cool. So it's always said, he's in Westminster Abbey. How could he be there? He's such an atheist. We'll see about that. He was born 1809. 1882 is when he died. 1859 is when the first edition of On Origin of Species was published. He published in the 1870s The Descent of Man. He was a little bit more, begrudgingly then. He was a bit, peeved that they had taken so much, I guess, flack for his Origins of Species. Origins of Species was not just his. Alfred Russel Wallace was in New Guinea, and he was in the Celebes Islands, and he'd come up with the exact same mechanism. And he writes a paper to Darwin, and Darwin goes, uh-oh, because he spent 20 years putting his book together. So then he said, okay, we're going to present to the Royal British Society of whatever. So they presented together this particular topic, okay? Descent with modification via natural selection. And we'll talk about that, okay? Now, I got some quotes up here. I would like you guys to go through these quotes with me right here. It says, this event, Origin of Species, represents perhaps the greatest intellectual revolution experienced by mankind. Wow. Darwin was wrong. Whoa. Evolution is as real as gravity. Okay. Darwin's black box, the biochemical challenge to evolution. Oh, okay. 2 centuries after its author's birth and 150 years after his publication, Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species can fairly be ranked as the most important book ever. I've read it. I didn't think so. It's a good book. Okay. Darwin devolves, replacing Darwin, the new Origin of Species. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. See how I juxtapose different ones? I tried not to pick too many religious people. It is this gentleman that we're going to use as our foci to discuss creation evolution. Theodosius Dobzhansky was alive in my time. He was this monster of a geneticist. We always heard about him. It's like, oh my goodness, okay? And he writes a paper in 1973, puts it in the American Biology Teacher entitled, Nothing in Biology Makes Sense Except in the Light of Evolution. So I got to read this kind of thing. What is he talking about, all right? Because I studied biology a lot as a kid. I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. Do you think I got a lot of evolution in my life? None. Guess what? People are saying, you're a good biologist. You should go ahead and get a degree. So I'm like, I didn't really need to have evolution to understand biology, I thought. But let's see what this gentleman has to say. And why is that paper espouses theistic evolution. There is an argument out there, and I would hope that people do not buy into this. I'm a Christian and a biologist. Therefore, if you want to eat your cake and have it too, or have your cake and eat it too, I forget which way it goes, you should be a theistic evolutionist. It's great. You got God the Creator. God designs this idea Darwin thought about, okay, descent with change, with modification through natural selection. It's not so easy. That is not just a default to say, oh, well, I'll just do theistic evolution. We're going to take a look at some of the difficulties and complexities that we're dealing with in the biological world, okay? It is a way. Francis Collins, who is the head of the NIH, is a very conservative Christian. He is an avid follower of theistic evolution. He calls it his third way. I say, good for him. That's awesome. He's a bright bloke. He's got an MD and he's got a PhD. But I'm not going to just jump ship because, hey, that's what it's supposed to be, okay? And we'll talk about what that is. Now, this is what he talks about in this paper: diversity in species, niche habitat specificity in biogeography, unity of life, simplicity of life, homology, observed evolution. So we're going to go through those. What does he say that supports his view of this evolution as Darwin basically outlined over a long period of time, yet he believes in God? Let's look at some of the evidence. Okay. All life. Now, here before we do that, I'm going to tell you this is probably one of the definitions that we'll use for evolution as Darwin outlined. I keep saying that because you're going to see later on, I'm not holding it back, that we're going to move away from that. Remember, 1859 is 160-some years ago. That theory might be old. All life, all species arose strictly through completely natural means, natural selection, from a single common ancestor that itself came into existence 3.8 to 4.2 billion years ago, strictly through natural processes. Now that would be a certain definition, okay? Why would we use a definition? From now we have a standard from which we can work on and move away from or address. Now here's the thing. And I'm going to give them credit for this. Evolutionary biologists do not have to show any way whatsoever how life arose. That is not their bailiwick. That's chemistry. That's origins of life researchers. That's physics. That is not an evolutionary biologist. An evolutionary biologist says, okay, some other people are working at it, but once you give me life, oh, I can tell you. Now, to get life, that's a different story. So origins of life ideas are interesting, but I'm not going to cover them. because we're going to cover evolution, we're going to cover creation ideas, okay? But I am going to give them their due. If some evolutionary biologist, Richard Dawkins, says, I believe in evolution, it's perfect, I'm intellectually fit atheist, how did life come about? I don't know. That doesn't dissolve his theories, his ideas. We're going to look at other evidence to challenge those views. Origins of life is different. Evolution is changing the properties of populations of organisms over time. In other words, the population is a so-called unit of evolution. Genes, individuals, and species also play a role, but it is the change in populations that characterize organic evolution. What evolution is, Ernst Mayr, again, a monster zoologist. I never got to meet the guy. I got his books. He lived about 100 years old. Fascinating bloke, what evolution is. He just wanted to write a book that brought his beautiful theory to life, okay? He's kind of like the Charles Darwin of the 20th century, right? So he talks about populations. We're going to look at these words, populations and species, and you're going to see what I'm talking about here. Okay? Now I want you to follow this right here. This is a Harvard experiment, okay? This is
is that there are 9 bands, and at the base of each of these bands, we put a normal Petri dish thick agar with different amounts of antibiotic. On the outside, there's no antibiotic. Just in from that, there's barely more than the E. coli can survive. Inside of that, there's 10 times as much, 100 times, and then finally the middle band has 1,000 times as much antibiotic. And then across the top of it, pour some thin agar that bacteria can move around in. The background is black because there's ink in it, and the bacteria appear as white. First, you see they spread in the area where there's no antibiotic, up until the point they can no longer survive. Then a mutant appears on the right. It's resistant to the antibiotic, it spreads, until it starts to compete with other mutants around it. When these mutants hit the next boundary, they too have to pause and develop new mutations to make it into 10 times as much antibiotic. And then you see the different mutants repeat this at 100. And after about 11 days, they finally make it into 1,000 times as much antibiotic as the wild type can survive. And so we can see by this process of accumulating successive mutations that bacteria, which are normally sensitive to an antibiotic, can evolve resistance to extremely high concentrations in a short period of time.
Okay, all right. So at the very end, you saw those lines and those nodes, okay? That's a typical tree. And you saw that bacteria that had no resistance to antibiotic in 11 days were resistant to 1,000 times the concentration of the antibiotic, okay? And what did they do to that plate? They didn't do anything to it. What did they say? A mutant appeared. There was bacteria, a random genetic change, and one of them, there's a lot of them in there, allowed it to live in the antibiotic. And so when it divided, all of its progeny could live in the antibiotic. And then there's another one. And this happened. Now, this happened over 11 days, and he said evolution, they involved. Does anybody know the term that we use for an evolution that happens over a short period of time? Have you heard that term before? Microevolution? And I say, do you know that Darwinian mechanisms wonderfully explain that right there? Absolutely applicable. You want to know about bacterial-resistant antibiotics at Advent Health? Darwinian explanations wonderfully explains that. As a matter of fact, it's magnificently well explained by Darwinian mechanisms. Microevolution is wonderfully explained and described by Darwinian mechanisms. But can that translate to all the diversity that you guys saw on those slides in this amount of time? We're talking about little tiny microscopic creatures that don't even have a nucleus. They have DNA in circles. And what did he say at the end? Was it another species or was it E. coli? Was Escherichia coli at the beginning? Was Escherichia coli at the end? So in my view, I'm going to argue this. I can see that, but I'm like, yeah, okay. That's the bacteria, and then you're going to tell me, oh, well, we'll just extrapolate that to the entirety of life on this planet? I don't see that. Now, there's a gentleman, Walter Veith. I think that you guys might like listening to him. He's really good. He was a zoologist, an atheist, and now he's a Seventh-day Adventist and a believer. So using a micro short-term event and then saying it easily is translatable and expandable to the entirety of things. So he had some videos, and he showed where there was a rain event out west. And after the storm, there was a canyon formed. It was like 20 feet, 10, 15 feet deep. And the canyon was remarkably similar in shape to the Grand Canyon. Okay? And he goes, aha! Therefore, it's easy to see that the Grand Canyon could have formed in far less than 3 to 30 million years that we think. By the way, I studied it. We don't know how long it formed. But there you go. Now, wait a minute. We argue really well that a micro example, a short-term example, something like this is not an indication of the grander whole. Okay? Unless it's for our purposes, for argument. I agree that there could be catastrophism, but to say that there was a little canyon formed in 30 hours and then just upscale that to the Grand Canyon. You see, the Grand Canyon is being cut through rock. That storm was cut through mud and sediment. Do you see what I'm saying? They'll try to cut through rock. But it does pique your interest to say, oh, well, maybe things could be a little different. Maybe things could happen if there was different geology. I just want to say, I do not use this as evidence for macroevolution. We don't really know the definition, but it is interesting to see. And if I was an MD, I'd want to know this kind of stuff before I start prescribing antibiotics, for example. This is a classic thing. Evolution, it's a no-brainer. It's just like a family tree. There's your common descent. The woman in the top, she has offspring. They begin to vary a little bit. Just extrapolate that to the whole planet. It's a nice metaphor. Let's look at the complexity. It's nice, but I don't think it's apt. I don't think it fits exactly. Okay, population growth rate. What if the population growth rate is greater than the environmental rates? In other words, if the population grows, there's so many individuals that they can't eat enough food because there's not enough food. By the way, that happens. Populations reach a point where there's no more resources at capacity. So they're all at capacity. They're trying to figure out. At capacity, wouldn't that create pressures? It does create pressures. I want some of that food. I got to do this. I got to do this. I want to live there. I want to get out of the rain. I want to do this, okay? Furthermore, it's clear there is variation in population. You guys see that. Have you seen dogs? They're all the same breed. Everything is the same species. However, in 500,000 years, if an alien came and saw all our dog breeds fossilized, they might go, wow, these humans are weird. They loved all these different species of dogs. They're all the same. They're interfertile and all this kind of stuff, okay? So, but you see variation in populations. If I get variation in populations and I get pressures on populations and I get nature kind of going, you're a little bit better adapted to this because you can get a little bit more food, you can feed your offspring. You're listening to Darwin's reasoning now, okay? Competition separates out those individuals better able to compete, right? So there's competition in his view. It's like we're going to struggle back and forth. Struggling back and forth might mean being sneaky or hiding. It's not always fighting. That's a fallacy. It's wherever you can have some more food. Separate those better able to get food, mate, shelter, habitats, territory. Individuals that separate naturally. Nature, by its very nature, would then tend to favor some individuals rather than others to live and reproduce in the environment. So some individuals, by chance, are better suited to a particular environment. They likely can produce more offspring than less well-suited individuals, and offspring are similar to parents. Thus, successful organisms tend to produce more offspring than relatively less successful organisms. But this is by nature. Nature does not have any conscience. It doesn't care who survives. It just happens to select those more able to survive. Now, I'm going to suggest something to you. I think one of the things about Darwinian evolution is that it's a very simple, nice, beautiful story. We kind of like those. I personally think the Genesis account of creation is a beautiful story. I think it's beautiful, right? I mean, you're looking at the creative interaction of this sovereign. And if that sovereign is like Jesus, who came as, manifest in human form as God, wow, that's an amazing thing, okay? So this is a beautiful story. It's kind of simple. Maybe that's one of the reasons why it took off, because it was simple. But does it account? And I think this is what we're now discussing. Does it account for those slides you saw about animals before? Individuals and groups populations are not the same. DNA generally underlies these differences. DNA randomly mutates. Proteins are constructed from DNA instructions. Proteins are building blocks of life, simply stated, okay? Some mutations, proteins just help a little bit. Some individuals in a group, the population survive. Therefore, nature just tends to favor some individuals over others. Those selected, better chance of reproducing, etc. It kind of seems like a nice little story, okay? Here's the reasoning. You could just see this happening. He was looking at pigeons and he was looking at clams. This is Darwin. He was like, man, look at these breeds of pigeons. They're so weirdly different. Chickens. You can't imagine. I saw a chicken that was all furry. Did you know now they've bred snakes without scales? Okay? That's what breeders have done. We got a remarkable variety, and it happened over a short period of time. Just extrapolate that out here. Okay? But we still have been staying within groups. Dogs, pigeons, bacteria. And that's not what we see out there in the world. We see remarkable, astonishing differences in living creatures. So, diversity of species. Okay, let's take a look at this. Speciation species. What is a species? So, if I have origins of species, I should know what a species was. And I did until I went to grad school. And I asked what are you talking about here? We don't even know what a species is. He goes, yeah, we don't know what they are, but they exist. Okay. I got to have some species here. If I don't have a definition of species, how can you even say there's any evolution if you don't even know what a species is? This book just came out. I was going to get it, but it was $1,000. Okay? There are 32 right now different species concepts. Now, Science News published the article on this new book about species, and they said, do you want to get biologists fighting? Ask them a definition of species. Okay? So I think this is fascinating. It is reasonable to suggest we don't know what species are of any kind. Now, I'm going to give you an example of what we're talking about. You're going to look on the left, you're going to see a gull that's got a nice dark mantle, the black back, and then you're going to see the other one's a gray. Now, the interesting thing about it is, on the right-hand side, you're going to see that we have an American herring gull, and you can see Greenland in the lower left corner, and then as you move up to the upper left corner, you're going to see that's North America and Alaska, but you're looking at it from... And then the American herring gull moves across the Bering Sea, and it starts interbreeding with the Vega herring gull in Siberia. The Vega herring gull interbreeds with the Birla's gull, that's also in Siberia, and the Birla's gull starts interbreeding with Hageland's gull, which is more around Finland and the European part, and the Hageland's gull interbreeds with the Siberian lesser blackback gull, and the lesser blackback gull interbreeds with that, but when the lesser blackback gull comes to Florida, and I've seen it here, the herring gull and lesser blackback gull don't interbreed. Wait a minute. A typical definition from Ernst Mayr of species, reproductively isolated populations. Reproductively isolated populations. That was his biological species concept. Now, that's nice, but we have weird things because you see, he was a zoologist, and all the plant people said, you're just talking about animals. See, plants are weird. I can bud, I can have asexual reproduction, I can have two sexes in one tree, I can have multiple sexes, I can have sexual reproduction sometimes and asexual reproduction the other time. In fact, there's an aspen forest in Oregon. It's huge. It's acres and acres and acres. It's all the same tree. Underneath the ground, they're connected, and they're called a genet. So wait a minute. What's the species? Okay? Now, you can see up on the upper left an alligator, down on the lower left an alligator lizard, and on the right-hand side an alligator juniper tree. All of you can see the difference between an alligator and the alligator juniper tree. Tree and an alligator. But if you start looking within juniper tree species, they kind of begin to blend a little bit. And if you look within the alligator lizard complex, which is in Texas and California, they begin to blend a little bit. And if you look in the alligator group, crocodiles are not like them, but caimans are. How do you know to separate those two, and who makes those decisions? So the species thing is a very difficult problem. I'm going to hand it to that. But wait a minute. If we don't know what a species is, then why does media say you're an idiot if you believe in creation? I'm not poking fun at evolution. I'm just saying that maybe not such an ironclad argument as we've been led to believe. That might also be the case, dare I say, on a creationist side. Our arguments often have weaknesses. That's fine. How do I know these things? I put these up here. They say that they're all different species. These are called the Empidinox flycatchers. I went out in the field to try to identify them. Forget about it. You're trying to see them, and they go, well, no, they're different species. They live in slightly different habitats, and they have a little different song, whatnot. They could all be the same, okay? I can tell you that animals that eat the birds doesn't care what they're looking at, okay? Niche, habitat specificity, and biogeography. Often biogeography is kind of missed in this debate, so I want to talk about that, okay? So, here's Theodoros Obzhansky from his paper. Perhaps the narrowest ecological niche of all is that of a species of fungus in the family Lubulbeniaceae, which grows exclusively on the rear portion of the elytra. Those are the wing coverings for the beetle Aphinops croni, which is found only in some limestone caves in southern France. That's where that fungus is found, on beetle butts, and that beetle is found in those limestone caves only. Here's the thing that he's picking on. Okay, I think he argued a straw man type of an argument. What did he do? He said those creationists, all of them believe simply this: every single life form we see was created in Genesis 1. Oh, wait a minute. Really? And so what does God do? He has some little fun. He wants to put a fungus on a beetle, and he sticks them in a limestone cave. So his structure of that argument, I don't really like. He took a few people's views and extrapolated that to all creationists. I don't like that. Thus, I should not do the same to certain evolutionary thinkers as well, should I? Now, how did they get there? I don't know, but it's cool. Larvae of the fly Drosophila carcinophila develop only in the nephric grooves beneath the flaps of the third maxilliped of the land crab Geocarcinus rucula, which is restricted to certain islands in the Caribbean. Why did I put this stuff up here? This is the stuff that I heard and I listened to, okay, in grad school and all these talks I was going to. Oh, those creationists, this is ridiculous. Isn't this amazing? Darwin is right. Don't pick on Darwin. He's kind of like the Jesus character for evolutionary biologists, okay? Just happens to be the case. He was just a simple man. He saw something. He just wanted to tell everybody, and why did everybody attack him? There's that parallel there. Okay, that's cool. That is an interesting point, okay? How did it get there? Is there an explanation to make intelligible reason this colossal diversity of living beings? Whence came this extraordinary, seemingly whimsical and superfluous creatures like the fungus, the beetle, Aphinops, the flies, Silopa, Petroli, and Drosophila, and many, many more apparent biological curiosities? What is he saying? Darwinian mechanisms. And it leads to the specificity because there's these environments, limestone caves and all this kind of stuff. Now I'm listening, I kind of get this crowd, and I talked to a lot of people about this. They're like, okay, and we believe Genesis 1. So, are there other ways of thinking about this? The only explanation that makes sense is that the organic diversity has evolved in response to the diversity of environment on the planet Earth. No single species, however perfect and however versatile, could exploit all the opportunities for living. Every one of the millions of species has its own way of living and of getting sustenance from the environment. Now, I'm going to go right to the point. He's talking about the ability to evolve and to adapt to remarkable different changes. And what does he need for that? I told you. He needed DNA, right? All right, how did we get DNA? I mean, that's not origins of life. That's a molecule. That's a big molecule. And it's got a lot of patterns to it. How do we get that? Well, if I'm locked into a materialist worldview, I can't say God created the DNA. I would say it had to come about somehow. Wait a minute. I need all this. Boy, I'm going to throw in my bias. If you already had those foundational elements already in place, you would have a framework from which to be able to have the ability to diversify amongst the different pressures. So I am mentioning something called intelligent design, okay? I'm going to talk a little bit about that because even if you can show intelligent design, it does not lead ipso facto to that there is a Judeo-Christian God. This is another fallacy. If I'm a Protestant or an Orthodox, what do I think of? Or a Jew, a Judeo-Christian God as the creator. Therefore, it leads to that, but it doesn't have to. It is supportive of, but it is not that's the only answer. okay, a Judeo-Christian type of God. It could have been lots of gods. It could have been like the Greek demiurges. It could be a really bad God who's just messing with us. It's just a supporting evidence of some kind of designer, okay? My bias, of course, is I think it's like Jesus of Nazareth, okay? So biogeography, this is a little issue. Here's what happens in creationist circles. Evolutionary circles can talk about their biology, their evolution, they can descent with modifications or whatever form you're looking at, but creationists, Jews, Muslims, and Christians have a little bit of a confounding factor. I have creation, and then shortly thereafter, I have the Noah's flood. Those two are coupled together. That adds some complexity because their suggestion is all things died. I don't know how they put trees on the ark and moss and fungus and all that. And I don't see any whales going on the ark, or guppies, or fish. But we have all these creatures put on the ark. And so then the ark lands in northeastern Turkey, right next to the Russian border, the now Russian border, on a pretty high mountain. Mount Ararat's over 16,000 feet. It's a volcano. Okay, so they come out of the ark. So how did the penguins get to Antarctica? They don't fly. They walk. They got to walk a couple hundred miles to the Black Sea. Apparently, they got to swim through the Black Sea. Then they got to go through the Dardanelles. That leads them into the Aegean Sea. That leads them into the Mediterranean Sea. Then they go out to the Mediterranean Sea. They go through the Straits of Gibraltar. And they decided to go left. So they went south. Kangaroos. They hopped. Now, I'm not picking on Noah's flood, but you hear that tone? Butler, what do you do with that? That's exactly the way it's been presented to me. How dare you think that? Okay? It's an interesting conundrum, isn't it? Because, marsupials, kangaroos are found in Australia. Deer are found mostly in North America and whatnot. Hummingbirds are only in the New World. Okay? So, lemurs, hey, only in Madagascar. What's up with that? Some fossil evidence in Java. That's only on the other side of the Indian Ocean. Why are they there only there? What about these things? Elapids are cobras. I go to Australia. You have about 90% of the snakes are venomous. They're not all deadly. 90% of the species are venomous, okay? Some of them are really, really venomous, and they all related to the cobra family. What's up with that? Even Africa doesn't have that. South America doesn't have that. Not only that, but we have kangaroos, megapoda or macropoda, and we have flying squirrels that are actually marsupials, and we have the koala. Actually, they're kind of cute. So we got all these creatures. Why there and only there? Well, there is something we're going to talk about called plate tectonics. Biogeography. These areas are distinctly different from all the other ones. If I want to see a slew of ungulates, hoofed mammals, called antelope, I do not go to Brazil. I go to Kenya. I go to Tanzania. I get to see stuff there, right? Now, if I wanted to see the giant anteater, then I go to South America. Okay? Man, if I wanted to see I'll call it the tiger snake, right? I'm going to go to southern Australia. Ooh, I get to see that there. Okay? If I want to see deer, I can go to Canada and Europe. I can see that, but I don't find elephants up there anymore, woolly mammoths. So there are collections. Not only is it animals, it's plants as well. So why are they distributed this way? The argument is that we had movement of these plates. This is new from the 1960s or whatnot, okay? And this is pretty well established. So how did this all happen? How fast do these things move? They move a couple of centimeters a year, right? Now, people have hypothesized that there's something going on. You guys, I want to just tell you quickly about this. So India has stuck into the Asian continent. And northern India has the Himalayan mountain range. They're the highest mountains in the world. Plus the Karakoram range in Afghanistan. But north of that Himalayan mountain is China. And the area is called Tibet. Now, Tibet is an area about the size of the southeastern United States. The average elevation is right at 14,500 feet. That is, if you're in Tibet and you're on the valley floor, if you move the Colorado Rockies there, you would be about 500 to 1,000 feet above their peaks. Now, this is a remarkable landform. How do you get so much area uplifted that much? You go over the northern edge, it drops off into the Taklamakan Desert and the Gobi Desert. North edge of the Taklamakan Desert is the second lowest point on the planet. It is the Tarim Depression. It's 512 feet, 550 feet below sea level. That's twice below sea level Death Valley. Death Valley is about 285 feet below sea level. The Dead Sea is 1,200 feet below sea level. I got below sea level, and then up above that is the mountain borders of China and Russia, 22,000-foot mountains. What's going on? The Andes Mountains, the longest chain of mountains in the world, right along the western coast. What's up with them? Oh, a subduction zone. The Pacific plate's going underneath it. Looks like it heats up, and they are volcanoes. So volcanoes are kind of ephemeral, okay? How did Hawaii get to where it is? Hawaii is volcanic, is it not? The Galapagos Islands, volcanic, okay? So there's some things that are going on. I think there is a very good explanation, and I think we need to understand complexity and not be locked into our views right now, okay? This seems to be reasonable evidence. Could have it happened faster than over hundreds of millions of years? I don't know. Unity of life. All known organisms use DNA and RNA. That's genetic stuff, right? All known organisms replicate to send us more closely related. We all use this thing called catalysis. You don't have catalysts, you're dead, okay? Proteins. All organisms use the same 20 amino acids. We're going to talk about this, okay? We have this thing called the universal genetic code. Hang on to that. All right. You do not have to memorize this. I did. All right? These are little things. These are amino acids, and if you look on the outside of that box down there, you'll see first base in codon, second base in codon, and third base in codon. Basically, DNA has 4 things in it, A, C, T, and G. Those 4 things move around, but there's combinations of 3 of those 4 things. Now, given 4 things and combinations of 3, we have 64 possible combinations. They are represented by those 3-letter codes for amino acids. There's 20 amino acids, 64 combinations. You have to have something tell the system to start making a protein, and you have to have something tell the system to stop making a protein. So you have a thing that we refer to as a gene on DNA. It's a long length of these 3-letter things called codons. And those codons then have another system that matches up with them and brings amino acids and puts them in the right position so we can make the right protein. And you need that. You don't want your hemoglobin going all wacky, if you get what I'm saying. So we have this system right there. All organisms use that. Nobody knows how that evolved. I read the paper. No one knows how that could have evolved. They thought it was a chemistry thing, a physics thing. All 7 hypotheses have failed. The argument is we'll study this for 50 years and we'll figure it out. Maybe so. But if we don't know how it evolved, why as media, and I'm going to pick on media, because I talk with a lot of scientists, atheists, materialists, evolutionists. We're talking together, we're doing fine. Media is telling us, you're idiots if you don't believe that. But that's a foundational, if I don't have that, I don't have diversity. I can't have it. How did that happen? Does anybody hear ideas of design right here? Because I'm going to tell you where not to apply intelligent design any longer, okay? This is a simplified picture of how to make proteins. That is in what's called eukaryotes, us cells. DNA has information. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's John 1:1. I found that interesting. A lot of other people have picked up word, information. Right now, we are not understanding where information comes from, and it's in our bodies. It was only until 1945 that the first real paper describing information theory came about. Information. How do you get information from nothing, from no information? This is a reasonable argument, okay? So this has to go on, okay? Complexity. All creatures use ATP. You got to have this thing called ATP. We have photosynthesis and chemosynthesis. Without that, life wouldn't be so good. We have this thing called a proton pump. We have glycolysis, Krebs cycle, oxidative phosphorylation. All creatures do this kind of thing, okay? You don't have to know this kind of stuff. Ribosomes, little things that put the proteins together, okay? I'm going to talk more. There's a remarkable complexity going on. He said something that I was reading that and I'm going, whoa. He said, this is all rather simple. He wrote this in 1973.
Cell. But what is a cell?
Let's take a look at this.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Darwin wrote The Origin of Species in 1859, published it in 1859. He had an idea of the cell as being quite simple, correct?
Yeah, everybody did.
Okay. If he thought of the cell as being a Buick, what is the cell now in terms of its complexity by comparison?
A galaxy.
If Darwin thought a cell was, say, a mud hut, what do we now know that a cell is?
More complicated than a Saturn V.
So what is in a cell as far as we know now?
A world that Darwin never could have imagined.
I needed someone who could give me a glimpse into this world. So we went to molecular biologist Doug Axe.
Think of a cell as being a nanofactory, a factory where, on a very small scale, digital instructions are being used to make the components of the factory. Here we have the famous DNA double helix. You can see the two helical strands that are intertwined and wind around each other on the outside of the molecule. This is the material that stores all of our genetic information. In higher life forms, this will be the equivalent of something like a gigabyte of information stored in the molecules that form the individual chromosomes, all packed within the nucleus, which is a tiny fraction of the entire cell size. So what does DNA do? Well, the information in DNA ends up providing the information for sequencing the amino acids to make protein. We have information in a one-dimensional form that provides the information for a three-dimensional form.
I'm finally just beginning to grasp the complexity of the cell.
Okay. I want to impress that let's not pick on Darwin. He had no idea. No one did. It keeps getting more and more complex the more we study. I might need some water. More and more complex. Quite simply, we do some analysis in our lab, in my lab, and we look at digital imagery. Originally, the imagery was from satellites of the Earth. Now I use techniques and I look at microscopy images of tissues. And we want to look at the patterns of cells. We have a very powerful computer in my lab. So we put the tissue in and we did our analysis, and halfway through it, the computer couldn't write any more to it. It was too complex to write. We all burst out laughing. We go, wait a minute. We had something that's designed for the Earth, and it was really complex. If we got a microscopy image, it's only 1 millimeter across, and you got cells in there. Shouldn't it be simpler as I got smaller? It got more complex. This is remarkable. It is at this level, ladies and gentlemen, that we start thinking about design. William Paley wrote a book in 1802, Natural Theology, and when he talked about walking and he struck his foot and he saw a watch, and if a watch was there, it couldn't possibly have just been there. It was created by artifice or artificers. Okay, so it's the watch idea, okay? So there was a watch in there, and so doesn't the environment look like this? And so I have, oh, thank you so much. So I have creatures eating other things, and I have plants making food, and bugs eating that, and then creatures eating bugs, and then when they die, they feed the plants when they decompose, okay? Thank you. But guess what? Darwinian mechanisms and evolutionary biology ideas easily explain design at the level of the environment ecosystems. And when I was listening to the late Stephen Jay Gould give his talk on the books of Rocks of Ages at the University of Michigan, he brought that up. He was like, somebody talked about design. We've already proved design is false when we looked at the ecosystem, and we showed that to be the case. And then he walked, and then he left that point. And I'm like, wait a minute. That's not what we're talking about anymore. You said we're going to do research. Okay? 1953 is when the discovery of the structure of DNA by Watson and Crick and Wilkins was recognized. Okay? Shortly thereafter, they were awarded the Nobel Prize. There was such hubris. We're going to know what life is all about in the next 10 years. That's done. Molecular biology revolution. It has not gotten that way. The complexity is ridiculous. I work with a group of people who study tuberculosis. We're studying Mycobacterium tuberculosum. It's a bacteria. Okay? I see brilliant people, Stanford, Michigan, University of Pittsburgh, Harvard, brilliant people. It's a bacteria. I'm like, what's the matter? This little bacteria is so complex, we cannot figure out how it can cause tuberculosis and all this thing. A bacterium. The things are ridiculously complex. And you told us that these came from certain fundamental parts. Those parts, though, could not have come fully formed. They would have to come piecemeal. Your system called Darwinian evolution doesn't account for that at all. Oh, we'll figure it out. That's true. Let me just tell you before we get any further. Don't spend time arguing against pure Darwinian evolution. I think what's going to happen is this. We're not talking about that in biological circles. We know it's far too complex for that. It's a nice metaphor. Okay, smooth change over a long period of time. Nature just kind of takes it, a random genetic mutation. And we got all this diversity. There's not enough time for all that. There's a lot of other ideas out there about evolution. So by the time we argue against it, you might be talking to an evolutionary biologist and go, yeah, we don't talk about that anymore. I mean, it's a great model. The guy did great. He can account for bacteria evolving resistance to antibiotics. So let's be careful about that. Okay? There's a lot of other models out there, which is far too complex than merely the way Darwin. Darwin is just held as kind of the father of this diversity. Okay? So we have here homology. He argues for this. You have pentadactyly. So do mice. Actually, porpoises do as well. Horses, you can see how they went from 5 digits now to 1 digit. You can see all this kind of stuff. Well, how could that possibly be? If we all had a common ancestor, we would probably have this holdover. That's a good argument. Counter-argument. What's so evolutionary cool about 5? There's no meaning there. So it's 5. So what? There's no evolutionary reason to have 5. It could be 6, 8, 10, whatever. Why 5? Why did it out-select 4? You need an opposable thumb, maybe 3 fingers. Maybe that's all you need. You get it more powered. So you can see how this argument is. It's like, you got all this similarity. Comparative anatomy is a powerful thing, but there's no compelling reason for why the structures are they are. It just so happens. Now, do we have common ancestry or do we have common plan? Common ancestry, common plan. There could be some common ancestry in there. You guys had great-grandparents, okay? Your pet dog had great-grandparents, and it probably came from a wolf-like creature, didn't your pet dog? Okay? But they're still dogs. Okay? Observed evolution. Bacteria evolving resistance to antibiotics. Okay? That's more evidence. The red shows that they got more resistance to antibiotics over time. Okay? Here's something they point out. Hey, creationists, you know there's over 500 species. This is true. Over 500 species of fruit flies in Hawaii. This is Lake Malawi cichlids. There's like 600 species of cichlid fish in Lake Malawi. And then, of course, Darwin's finches. I like Darwin's finches. There's about 13 of those. So how did we get 500 species of fruit flies in Hawaii? 600 species of cichlid fish in the lake. They're all the same species. We call that adaptive radiation. That is a nice thing to say. I like it. It's phenomenal. It's fantastic to see that kind of a thing. You guys, you see evolution at work every day in Orlando. All of you do. Because you go walking outside and you see those lizards running around your feet, don't you? The little brown anole lizards. They're not from Florida. They're either from Cuba or the Bahamas. Now, it does not freeze in Cuba, and it does not freeze in the Bahamas, but anole lizards are already living up, the brown anoles, Anolis sagrii, I had to be a geek. They live all the way up in southern Georgia. You know, it freezes. And you guys have heard about the iguanas in Miami. They're getting freeze tolerant right there. Okay, simple Darwinian mechanisms for this stuff we call small or microevolution. But that, I am going to suggest, in my tastes, I don't want to have a fight with my colleagues, but it does not support my view on how I could think of all of life that we see on the planet. Seems there must be more. Okay, overall problem that all living things on this planet arose as a result of random mutations, mostly or undirected process with subsequent natural selection over a long time, resulting in adapting an organism. That's a strict Darwinian view. I've studied this a long time, longer than you guys. I don't see how these mechanisms can account for the variety of stuff that I see. I just don't see how it could be the case. I don't see how it's the case that God created all this stuff as is at the time of the creation event. I don't see that either. I'm not trying to pick on belief system, but I'm like, and he stuck that fungus on a beetle and stuck it in a limestone cave? Maybe. I don't see that. Maybe his creative power is in the ability to create a system, a design, that is adaptable in the face of the fall. My theological view is that Satan may not be just interested in all humans not being saved. Life is very special. Maybe to really get God back, get rid of all life. And even under this pressure, living things live. We have to eat each other now. We have flies that lay eggs on caterpillars, and it's kind of horrible. It's called parasitid wasps and flies. You know that certain spider females eat the male right after mating. Okay? You know that. This is a kind of a strange world. But life is persisting in this situation. And I think life is something of a God-directed beginning. Okay. Dembski. Guy's brilliant. Mathematician, philosopher. Basically, origins of life. I know this is claimed outside of it, but we have no mechanism of how life could have started. Origin of genetic code. No clue. Mechanisms posited for it, I don't think work at all. Origin of multicellular life. I saw a talk. Bacteria have been on the planet for 4 billion years. They haven't changed. This is a talk from an atheist, evolutionary biologist, origins of life person. And that's just saying it. I'm agreeing. I'm not picking on them. But somehow something happened. We have multicellular life. Origin of sexes. Very difficult to figure out. Scarcity of transitional forms in the fossil record. Cambrian explosion. Development of complex organ systems. Development of irreducibly complex systems. That populations change over time is a fact observable. Well accepted, but that natural selection or evolution is a fact is a different story. Things are changing over time. This has just got moved off the slide a little bit. But wait a minute. Natural selection accounting for all this? That model is no good. On the other hand, how evolution occurs is a complex matter subject to theory. I read this in class to the students. You're going to get hit with this really quickly, the whale series. You go to Smithsonian Museum of Natural History or the American Museum of Natural History, I guess it's the American Museum of Natural History is in New York. I forget how they name it. In the Smithsonian in D.C. on the Mall, they have a great series of the whale series. I actually met the gentleman who was responsible for finding a lot of fossils. And this is what they did. They had found some fossils, and they could look at the movement of the ear, inner ear moving in the skull. This is an important fact, okay? And they looked at the legs be kind of getting smaller and the pelvis changing. So they had one old whale, they had another whale, and they said, you know what, we hypothesize that there would be a intermediate species, and it should be in these layers of sediment. And they went to Egypt or Morocco, they dug in the sediment, marine sediment, and they found that. They predicted what it might look like. Look at you guys. Here's a fossil record. It's 50 million years of fossil record. Your 6,000 years is ridiculous. Okay? So the whale series is really, really good right now in terms of that. Let me tell you a little bit about the whale series. Okay? It's 50 million years, 55 million years, but the actual transition from terrestrial to aquatic, they say, occurred in about 8 million years. That's shortening the time down. See, Darwin believed in Hutton and Lyell, long time. We call it deep time. But wait a minute, and here's the problem. You see, whales live in the ocean. They give birth in the ocean. If you gave birth head first, by the time you had the complete birth of the baby whale, it would have drowned. So it has to be a breech birth. Now, wait a minute. This doesn't just happen. You just don't flip a whale fetus and then come out. You have to change structures. Now remember, Darwinian mechanism says it all would have happened from random genetic changes that just so happen to confer a small, slightly better change. Wait a minute, either you come out head first or not. That's it. Now how did that happen? I am, again, not going to be jumping up them and say that whale series is a lie. I'm not going to say Satan put it in there. It's not my tastes. I'm going to say it exists, but what about this? And I think what happens is they go, that's a good question. Maybe this could have happened. I get it, but it's not quite as nice linear as you're often led to believe that these fossil series are. The fossils exist. Leonard Brand, he retired from Loma Linda, great paleontologist, great zoologist. He studied whale fossils. He could tell you a lot about this, and I think his arguments would be really bright. He's very sharp. It's a good person to listen to. What is the driving source? I'm going to skip over that, okay? This right here caused a lot of problems. Stephen Meyer, he was looking at the data, and he says about 550 million years ago, something happened in about 8 million years. This is what we're talking about. We had the Cambrian explosion. We had these simple creatures, and all of a sudden, in the fossil record, we had what's called body plans. I need to convey this to you. I've been talking about species, and I showed you a juniper tree, and I showed you an alligator. They are in different phyla. So we have species, right? Genus, family, order, okay? All the way up until we get to phylum, and then we would have kingdom, although we have domains. So this is a big thing. And how do I know one phylum from the other? The structure of the body plan. Magnificently different body plans. We have a hole in our body in which our stomach and our intestines are in. We are coelomates. Some creatures do not have that, like planaria worms. You know that jellyfish and starfish have a radial symmetry. We are bilaterally symmetrical. That's completely different. Portuguese man of war is a colony of creatures. We have remarkably different body plans. So about 30 to 40 of those body plans evolved, we see in the fossil record, over an 8 million year period. This no longer is an idea of diversity. We call it disparity. Species evolving is nothing. But going to different body plans in 8 million years, you have to evolve new cell types, new tissue types, new organs. Now, if this process occurred over, they said, 500 million years, they would have a better argument. But we're saying this is a big debate, and I would want you to be aware of this. The Cambrian explosion is a remarkably difficult thing to explain as we know it now, using pretty much any of our theories, because this would have occurred after creation event. I don't know. I think it's a fascinating thing. Okay? It definitely is a bit of I would say, a snare in an argument. This is some of the ideas. I'm not going to show you all this. Okay? This is another thing. It's a genetic tree. I mean, like from octopuses. You know, octopuses are really smart, by the way. Okay. Design. Biology exhibits bad design. So this is the other thing that I want to talk about. I hear a lot of people talk about, please don't do this. This is just a pet peeve of mine. It's a metaphor, and it's glorious. It's glorious. The story is, I was in the hospital, and the pregnant mom came in, and I witnessed the birth of a child. Oh, isn't that just amazing? Therefore, evolution is false. It's the design. It's phenomenal. Okay? That's very easily explainable through Darwinian mechanisms. Okay? We can look at that. It's a beautiful metaphor. It's nice. Okay? It does not really do anything for design because you see there's infant and maternal fatalities from this stuff. Okay? Now, Michael Behe is arguing against that the eye is good design, but basically we have a layer of tissue in front of the photo-receiving cells. That's like putting a little tissue in front of your camera lens that blocks the light coming in. Eyes are interesting because I can tell you that you can use evolution to show this. Did you know that there are populations of creatures, salamanders and fish mostly? The populations are not different species. They are very closely related genetically. Some live outside of the caves, and they have eyes. Those living inside the caves have reduced eyes or no eyes at all. No need for eyes there. It's a lot of energy. Remember, those little things are explainable short-term by Darwinian mechanisms, okay? So we have those things. Design does not indicate God as a designer. I think it is. I use other evidence, like religious and theological evidence. Does not follow that bad design equals no designer, but just how that design is portrayed by those who believe in such. So this is where I was just talking to a gentleman at a conference Friday. He's at FIT. During the talk, we don't talk about our faith, but outside we start talking about it. And I say, yeah, you know, it's amazing. I see so many people arguing that it's either religion or science. And he's like, I never saw that. I never saw that you couldn't be religious and do science, and you couldn't do science. So here's this gentleman at FIT, Florida Institute of Technology, going, hey, wait a minute. You see, to understand the world, it might not be either religion telling us how to understand the world, and it might not just be science telling us how to understand the world. Maybe we need more. Maybe we need science and religion. Maybe we need history, philosophy, literature. Maybe we need all these things put together. Why do we elevate one over the other and then pit them against one another? I don't understand that, okay? I think we need to have more inclusivity. This guy wrote in 1802, we don't see design there. We see design now in these little things, ribosomes and DNA and all the stuff are like universal genetic code. What's up with this, okay? As a biologist, we understood that species, individuals, and a single... Now, this book is by this gentleman, David Quammen. David Quammen is an evolutionary believer, but he's a professional science writer. He wrote a book called The Tangled Tree. I had to read this book. I did. And in the very last pages of this book, this is what he wrote, and I think this is something that is remarkably powerful. He wrote that species is not a discrete, right here, it's not a discrete entity. Remember I told you, what is a species? We used to think they were a unit, a category. No. Wait a minute. Individuals are not discrete. Okay, point and case, or case and point. I don't know which way to do it. If you go and stand outside in certain parts of Florida and don't look at your feet, you might get fire ants up on your knees. Okay? They're all sisters. They're all genetically related. And they even know how to release pheromones to tell you to sting at the same time. What's the individual? Why will they give up their life for one another to survive? It's almost as if the colony, and I don't have time to tell you the experiments, the colony itself is the individual. What? Wait a minute. 50 to 100 trillion cells in your bodies. How many have heard of the microbiome? This is fungi and bacteria and viruses in your body. They actually produce neurotransmitters. They can figure out, their composition can help you have a better attitude, lose weight, I need those bacteria. So there is more of them in and on you by a factor of 10 to 100 times more than your own cells. What's an individual? I'm going to pick on allopathic medicine right here. Probably some MDs are going to go like, hey, okay? Because there's still this idea that diseases kind of come at random from inside your body. I'm a population health guy, public health official. It is well understood that place can actually dictate your longevity. Where you live is correlated for how long you are going to, where you live is going to correlate for how long you will live, okay? We say all the time, zip code influences genetic code more than genetic code influences zip code. You are not impervious to the outside world. It used to be that case. Well, we're an autonomous being. There's nothing coming in. No. We're interacting with it all the time. I'm not talking about conspiracy theories about the contrails and cell phones and all that kind of stuff. They may be part of that, but I'm talking about just real environmental processes. Hey, we all know there are carcinogens in the environment. Then we could get them in us somehow. And then we have an increased risk of a bad-forming cell tissue type. We are not independent of the outside. We're not independent of one another. We are exchanging stuff all the time. Therefore, Darwin hypothesized that there would be a single universal tree of common descent and origins, and we'll figure it out. And when I was in grad school, we worked on that really, really hard. Quammen's book and all this now knows it's going to be impossible to figure that out. That doesn't mean evolutionary biology and those people who study it are fools, or it just says it's far more complex. Remember I said complexity than we've imagined, okay? Seems that the evolution measured is a lot like this. I don't have time to do that. I think I gave that to you, okay? I want to get out of here. It's getting late. The law is beginning to... So, this is Charles Darwin. Last page, first edition on the origins of species. I actually have that book. Sorry, but I have that book. This is what he writes. The laws being growth with reproduction, inheritance, variability, a ratio of increase so high as to lead to a struggle for life, and natural selections, divergence of character and extinction. Thus, from the war of nature, the production of the higher animals directly follows. There is a grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one. This is Darwin, first edition. He was a theist. What might have happened to Darwin? It seems Annie, his youngest, or one of his youngest children, about 10 years old, she went through a prolonged, horrible, slow death of tuberculosis. And he watched this. Remember, pain and suffering. Does anyone have a good idea about that? And we all suffer from it. I'm sure you've given sermons about that. Pain and suffering. He saw that happen. And it is argued, and I haven't read those books, that after that day that she died, he never uttered it again. He never fought. His wife was a devout follower. He loved her. But he did not utter it, anything more about God. The problem of pain. Okay? This is the rumor. I read the books. I'm kind of believing that. Would have pushed him over the edge. But he was definitely a believer. He's actually trained to be a priest. What is evolution? What is creation? There's magnificent complexity and detail. There's fundamental necessary components of life. How did they evolve? DNA and those things. Seems like there's a created design thing in here. DNA, universal genetic code, ribosomes. We don't know how any of this kind of came about. Ridiculous number of living things of magnificent variation. That is something that I want to convey to everybody. Darwinian evolution, not a strong model. Guys, I do not think I see much argument on Darwinian models in the future. I do not think I see that. There's a lot of other structures out there. Some from Stephen Jay Gould, the late Stephen Jay Gould. Fossils support long Earth, however, and evolution ideas, but how they form fits better with short Earth flood and all this. It's weird. Okay. All right? But how did they form? Well, it was a flood. And you're like, okay. It's really fascinating, okay? What is a species? What is an individual? Natural selection, not a force. It's not a force. In fact, it's nothing. How can nothing do so doggone much? That frustrated me when I found that out. The theory of evolution is not monolithic. There's an idea called punctuated equilibrium. You got a lot of change in the nut, Stephen Jay Gould. Are you a pan-selectionist? Well, I'm not going to tell you what those are. Are you a structuralist? What about group selection? I kind of fall into the group selection category. Neutral theory, Lamarckian or Darwinian? I have to stop right there and tell you something about Lamarck. He was a French guy. He proposed evolution. He said you acquire traits. The giraffe acquired its long neck because during the time it was in the African savanna, it was a drying period. And the trees and the leaves were getting higher up on the trees. And Stan, you've been to the savanna. So those that stretched their neck passed on the stretching genes to their offspring. Now, Darwin and all those, and I heard this, like, oh my God, that's so bad. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a thing called epigenetics. Epigenetics. It's on top of your genetics. It's acquired traits that are passed on to your offspring. The sins of the fathers onto the third and fourth generation. Mentioned in the Bible, epigenetics. The environment can imprint on your genetic code, not a change in the A, C, T's, and G's, but how they're expressed. How they're expressed is ridiculously similar to who you are. So they studied that in grandmothers. And then people who have obesity. Wait a minute. We don't see any change in the genetics, but they came from this house. Violence in the household. It wasn't just growing behaviorally, it was altering the effect of the genetic code. You are not immune from the environment you are in. That seems to be a Sermon on the Mount kind of a thing as well. Okay? I think this is a very much... That was a good one. You should have seen it when I did it in ecology class, right in front of the students. Sprained my ankle, fell right on the floor. It was the best. Epigenetics, horizontal gene transfer. I'm giving you his word, micro versus macro evolution. Maybe there's the small stuff, it's okay. Common ancestor or common plan. I like that term, common plan. Design. Here are some books that I was using for this, and I gave that to you in your handout. Last slide. This on the left is the Colosseum in Rome. I've been there, okay? This one on the right is in Slovenia. Looks like they would have been designed by the same people. Completely different parts, but it works. Is that a common ancestor of buildings? I'm not trying to be flippant here. You get what I'm saying? Wait a minute. There's an argument. Well, if God created them specially, why do we have the universal genetic code? Well, God's not stupid. Why would he create a code for every single group of creatures out there? One code seems to work well from bacteria to elephants. Okay? So this argument, when you get a straw man argument about our beliefs, I don't think it's the case that we should follow that. Here's a little bit more, and then I'm going to leave you with that. Obviously, there's a lot more questions, and this is very difficult to provide this. It's getting late, and you guys have been patient. I gave you guys a handout, and of course, you're always welcome to come and talk or email. I didn't put my email on there. I might not be able to respond right away, but I think that this right here, my final comments are the fact that you guys are listening and are part of this, I think is a powerful testament to your faith. You have a strong faith because you don't mind if you hear some other ideas that might impinge on your worldview. You don't have to accept those kind of things. You can find a whole variety of different things to look at. What is my point? It's not as simple and clear-cut as often it seems to be made to believe. Creation versus evolution. I say that, and I don't believe it. I do not think it has to be a versus. I don't think it's a verse at all. It doesn't mean I know the answer. I'm not saying that you guys have to believe in a long earth. You don't have to do that at all. I'm not saying you have to believe in a 6,000 years, 6 literal days. If you want, you can do that. All of our worldviews will have weaknesses at some point. And as we write, and Stan brought up in class, a quote from, I forget who did it, if you do not know the argument of your opponent, you do not know your own either. Okay? Amen. Thank you for your patience.
Let's give Dr. Butler a round of applause. Thank you.
Was that a 9 on the fall or a 10? A 9, and it was a 10. Thank you.
Well, actually, out of that argument for complexity, that's really, I don't know about you, but when I hear somebody that's very knowledgeable, especially in the biological sphere and all the different diversity, really that's one of the main reasons I wanted to have these discussions here at the church, because it's not a simple, we can't build straw man arguments against anybody that has a viewpoint other than ours. You'll be here next week as well, and maybe we'll save, if you have some questions, just because we went a little bit longer than we normally do, why don't you come back next week and you can...
It'll be much faster next week.
It'll be much faster, and then we'll have maybe some time for questions
Yes.
Afterwards. So let's just bow our heads for prayer before we're dismissed. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you. We thank you for all the diversity that we see, the rich complexity of life. And Lord, you've created each one of us so diverse, and we see that same thing in the natural world. Lord, I pray that you will be with us and protect us until we meet next week. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.